So a hot topic this year has been affirmative consent. On college campuses around the country, starting in California, they have passed rules where every sexual encounter requires continuous consent throughout the entire sexual act or process. Now, there's been plenty of discussion, heated discussion, and arguments and videos and articles written about affirmative consent and whether it's good or bad. And while I am not a supporter of affirmative consent, I think it formalizes the process too much. I'm not here to talk about that. That is a subject for other people to fight over. Interestingly enough, the idea of affirmative consent, I think the base idea of consent is actually a great idea. It's actually something that libertarians talk about all the time, and we're actually kind of obsessed over as well, but in a different way. So I would like to take a little time to connect the dots a little bit. Now, while affirmative consent I think is silly, I think there is something valuable to be extracted out of it, and I think it would be an interesting thought experiment for feminists to consider expanding their conception of consent. Ironically, I've just recently I Googled, feminism and consent, and read a bunch of articles about what feminists are saying about consent. And interestingly enough, if you boil it down to a principle, it's the principle of self-ownership, which is it was just a really funny connection for me, since that's what libertarianism and classical liberalism and stuff, that's the same place we start with. We start with self-ownership, and the idea of feminist consent is also based in self-ownership, whether they fully understand that or not. So in a lot of these articles, they thought they're being new and unique and thoughtful and breaking new ground with the idea of consent by saying, oh, well, consent is not just about sexual consent and in the bedroom. It also expands to our everyday interactions with each other. All our interpersonal interactions also involve a lot of consent, which should be and needs to be respected. And I totally agree with it. Totally agree. Only they don't take it far enough. It's another situation where, if I talked a little bit about this in my intro to the non-aggression principle video a little whiles back, but they have this general rule and understanding of morality that they would like everybody to play by. But then when it goes to the government or the societal level, I guess government, not necessarily the societal level, but to the government, it gets flipped on its head and consent no longer matters. For instance, whether that's, paying taxes, or the war on drugs, or preventing people from entering certain professions without a license. It was really funny. I was reading a couple of the articles, and they're saying, like, it's your body and nobody has the right to encroach on it. There was one of them said you should even ask consent to just having like friendly physical touch with another person, whether it's to brush their hair or to give them a hug, or just breaking the physical barrier. Even that involves a level of consent that you need to ask for before you you engage in it or you break the physical barrier. And imagine if they used that level of sensitivity to consent, to being governed, to the level of consent that is needed and should be applied between the individual and the government. Because as far as I understand it, feminism is also very sensitive and very focused on power imbalances. Well, what's one of the greatest power imbalances in society? It's between the individual and the government. And therefore, you would think they would also understand, maybe some of them do, I just don't hear them speak about it, but there also then needs to be a great level of consent and carefulness between the government and us. The government needs to be equally, I would say even more sensitive than it is to our consent to what happens with our tax dollars, or going to war, or controlling what we do, or spying on our digital communications, or preventing us from engaging in peaceful activities, or any of the number of things that the government prevents us from doing and controls our activities, is just as important, or I would say vastly more important than trying to police every interpersonal interaction where the power disparity is much less. So like, if I was just talking to a friend or somebody I didn't know very well and they wanted to give me a hug, fine. Maybe it would be nicer for them to ask first. But I consider that infraction of consent, or if it is wrong or not desirable for them not to ask me first before giving me a hug, I consider that way, way low on the list of sins than the government coming in, taking a third of my income, or everybody's income, I guess, depending on how much money you make, but taking your money and then spending it on things that you find morally reprehensible. And so the feminists they're onto something. They're close. They're so close, but yet so far. So I would invite any individual that fancies themselves a feminist, or someone who is sympathetic to that train of thought and to the idea of affirmative consent. Well, let's be really radical. Let's apply that not only to the interpersonal interactions, let's apply that to the most powerful societal organization in the country, which is the government. And I think that is a much better place to start than to try to police everybody else's interactions, often without their consent, interestingly enough. But yeah, open your mind, man. Open your mind, expand it. It's not just in the bedroom. It's not just the people around you. And the feminists do get that there are societal forces and societal, that there are forces bigger than the individual and groups. Well, don't turn a blind eye to that government. Unfortunately, it might be a little bit hard to apply the idea of affirmative consent, or just consent in general, to the government, because, well, if you do that, then you can't petition the government to tell other people what to do.